All right, good morning, everybody. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I think we should get started. You may notice one of our panelists is not here yet. She just found parking, so she's going to run in as soon as she gets here. But we'll get started with our other panelists. So good morning. My name is Lee Wright. I am the product manager for content on eBook Central here at ProQuest, part of Clarivate. And today we're going to be talking about indigenizing library collections. And with me, I have Wiley Barnes, Sarah DuPont, and Jennifer Randall is our third panelist who will be arriving shortly. So I want to dive in. I want to get started with introductions. So I'm going to hand it over to Wiley first to kick us off. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how the inclusion of Indigenous materials impact both Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners.
Sure. Chokma, Soho Chafoy, Wiley Barnes, Chikasha Saya. Hello, my name's Wiley Barnes. I'm a Chickasaw citizen, and I'm the director of Chickasaw Press. We're we like to say we're the only known tribally owned press in the United States. We're not the first. There has been some others that have started that have since either not published anything in a while or gone defunct. But we were established in 2006, basically out of the desire to tell our story from our perspective. And so since then, we have 3 imprints now. We publish across all genres, and we have about 75 books in our catalog. We also publish Chokma Chickasaw Magazine that comes out twice a year. And then we publish the Journal of Chickasaw History and Culture, which is an academic journal that comes out twice a year. That publication's been around since 1994. And so I've been director since 2013. But I've also worked for the Chickasaw Nations for 17 years. And then I worked for another publishing company for 8 years before that. So about 24 years of publishing experience. How has the inclusion of Indigenous materials impacted both Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners? This knowledge is really important to us to the continuance of shared Chickasaw cultural identity, and particularly for our population of Chickasaw citizens, it continues to grow. So our citizens grow within our boundaries, which is in Oklahoma, southern Oklahoma, and then we also have citizens across the world. So generating our own publishing and research is basically an act of ownership of owning our own history, but exercising self-determination and cultural sovereignty. So when we do this, we're able to share our history and culture with non-Chickasaws, thus enhancing our relationships with our neighbors and creating a greater awareness of Chickasaw history and culture. And so one of the challenges that we face even in Oklahoma, that the Chickasaw Nation faces, that non-First Americans, non-natives, and particularly non-native Oklahomans know very little about Chickasaw history and culture. So our values at Chickasaw Press are based on Chickasaw values of community, sharing, and education. And we strive basically through our books, to revitalize and strengthen our cultural identity. And then through institutions like libraries and universities that are sharing our history, all these points are reiterated. So.
Hooray, Jennifer made it.
Sorry, Indian time.
Hi, Jennifer, if you'd like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the impact on Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners.
Okay. So sorry, I just ran from Visitor Center. So my name is Jennifer Randall. I am the lead archivist at the International African American Museum here in Charleston. I've been here for about a month, hence how much I forgot about traffic. So I really got involved in academic archives before this position. I was the archivist at University of North Carolina at Pembroke. In North Carolina, that is the only traditionally Native school. So a lot of what got me involved is growing up and not knowing our history everything required academic resources, and we didn't have the capability of accessing those. So we didn't get a lot of our history. So that really sparked my interest in history and then archives, and here I am now. So a lot of what I do is decolonizing accessibility, standards and protocols for archives and academic libraries.
All right, and now Sarah.
That's okay.
Good morning. My name is Sarah DuPont. I'm the head librarian of the Huihua Library. I'm not doing head librarianship work right now. I'm working on a special gray literature project as I return from a leave of absence, and it's been really wonderful getting my hands on collections work again for the time being. The Huihua Library it's in Canada. I'm from Vancouver, Canada, on Musqueam territory, and I've worked there for 14 years. And prior to that, I was a public librarian with the Edmonton Public Library. I'm Métis on my father's side and settler Canadian on my mother's side. And one of the reasons I'm really personally invested in the work that we do is because in my father's community, there was a little museum. And I remember going to it as a 7-year-old child. And I remember seeing our family tree painted by hand on the plywood barn doors that would open and greet you into the museum, and all the wonderful treasures that were inside there. And it burned down. And a lot of my family's materials and belongings were there, and it's gone. So now there is a new museum that just opened, and new treasures that have been found have been donated and placed there. But it's really urgent work. The work of gathering knowledge in its multiple forms, not just in our belongings, but what our elders remember from their childhoods, because they're the next ones who are going to leave us. And that remembering is really important work. And the people who recorded their memories and who have gone on to the spirit world, those memories are often trapped in analog media. And so freeing that knowledge so that the people can use it for the work that we need to do now, where we are positioned to do that work now with language, transcription, and translation work that we may not have had the resources to do prior. So that's why I'm personally invested in it. And the impact of the Huihua Library's work has been very, very, very broad. The work of that library, first of all, the word Huihua is a Squamish word, and it means echo. And this library is part of the First Nations House of Learning, and that resides on the campus of the University of British Columbia. But this longhouse was a true, this was a true initiative of the community, the Indigenous community. They wanted the longhouse to be a home away from home for Indigenous students who faced many barriers going to university. So it has a province-wide mandate. There is a huge amount of cultural diversity among Indigenous peoples in our province. And we have a collection that is really focused on the materials that are by, for, and about Indigenous people. But there's been an explosion of Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous publishing, and that's really joyful for a lot of us to see. And so now we're making choices about what to put on the footprints of our space. And those are good decisions to make, where we can say, you know what, we want to focus on stuff written by Indigenous people. The impact that it's had on our learners is that we've been able to represent Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voices through the curriculum in all the many, many diverse programs and services that our university has been representing Indigenous knowledge through for many decades now. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
All right. So let's dive in with our first question. What are the most effective ways for libraries to engage with Indigenous communities and stakeholders to ensure their perspectives are accurately represented in library collections? Jennifer, you have the mic. Would you like to start?
So in my previous position, I worked at UNCP, which is located in the heart of the Lumbee Nation, which is a very, very large Indigenous population, a very huge but very tight-knit community. However, a lot of the resources that we had on the library website were not curated by or really for Lumbee people. So last semester, I went and sought out an intern in the American Indian Studies program. She is a Lumbee student, and she wants to be an archivist. And so she was the perfect candidate for this project. We actually recreated the library's Lumbee Cultural and History website, or LibGuide. Diving into that, we really realized that it had been curated by non-native white librarians, despite having so many people just on library staff who were Lumbee or other from other Native communities. But no one really reached out to them to get that information. And so my student's name was Savannah. Savannah is from the area. Obviously, her entire family is very involved in the community. So she was the perfect candidate. And getting her involved, I also got the Kevin Melvin, who was the Lumbee preservation tribal historian. I believe he has a very long title, but getting him involved, and we completely reworked the entire LibGuide. And it includes information about Lumbee that would be relevant to the Lumbee people themselves, students learning about the Lumbee, and teachers teaching about anything in Lumbee culture and history. But we cleared everything through working with the tribe and then working within the community. We found amazing resources. One of the coolest aspects of it was we recreated this, I should say Savannah really created it, this really cool study guide, and it's broken down into type of resource, but they're all scholarly resources, and 99% of them are written by Lumbee scholars. In fact, we were able to even find records of the Lumbee ancestors at Carlisle and other schools and include that. And a lot of the Lumbee weren't even aware that they had ancestors there. And so it was just such a small effort on my part as a librarian to reach out to the community, to reach out to the American Indian Studies program, to get a student who wants to do this in the future and create this LibGuide. And it's been so powerful. A lot of the professors have been using it. A lot of K through 12 teachers have reached out and asked to use it, and it's publicly available on UNCP's library website. And so just reaching out into the community, reaching out into your Native student population makes a huge difference.
We're going to probably all piggyback on each other on this, but so relationships are important. So my recommendation is we love it when libraries or universities reach out to us, because so I would recommend in your own community to reach out to those Indigenous communities that are right there, because that's the effective way to start, is tell their story where you live. There's people in that community. And most First Nations, tribal nations will have some sort of cultural affairs or heritage center office, and most of them will be forthcoming and welcoming, and they can provide you, even if they're not like us, that we have our own publishing entity, they're going to have resources, they're going to have recommendations, they're going to have books, they're going to have unpublished research that they're very willing to give you, so that you can tell that story from their perspective. And just know that new research is being uncovered, new books are being published. So I wouldn't, every year it's changing. It's like they said, it's kind of an exciting time, both in the US and especially in Canada. And so I would just keep it important that you can have a very diverse collection if you stay on top of it. One thing that's like in our own small rural community, this is where the Chickasaw Nation headquarters is in Ada, Oklahoma. And so we have really good relationships with all the schools, to the point that several of our local elementary schools offer Chickasaw language as a language credit in high school. So you can actually take and learn Chickasaw. And so those are some things that relationships are important, and they can grow and build into other things that you couldn't even imagine were possible. And so there's, students, young Chickasaw citizens, and even non-Chickasaws that are learning Chickasaw language in a public school setting.
So one of the ways that UBC Library started this engagement when I first started working there was getting to know the land in a place-based learning opportunity. A lot of our elders talk about the land as our library. And so understanding the place where we work every day, knowing that Musqueam as a First Nations reserve community is a 10-minute drive down the road from our very affluent university community, it's important for people who are potentially serving Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff to have an understanding of where we are and how this place has been shaped by colonial forces over the years, and how we can start to collaborate from there, because if you don't know where you are, it's pretty hard to know where to go. So getting a grant from within our academic institution for an EDI initiative, we chartered buses and, of course, worked with the nation to plan these visits, these place-based learning experiences, where we worked with people who had knowledge and who are often called upon to give these opportunities, these learning opportunities to various groups of people, working with them to lead us around and tell us stories about the plants, about the longhouse, about what they could and couldn't show us, because not all knowledge is necessarily available for public consumption. And that's a tension area between libraries and information repositories. That's where, maybe some of our core values around freedom to read, that we all have the degree that really focuses on that aspect. That's where we really need to kind of reshift our way of thinking around knowledge and who it's meant for. And there's a really fantastic example out of the United States, out of the Washington State University, developed by Dr. Kim Christian Withy and all of her many community partners. It's called Mukurtu, and that's not how it is spelled. It looks like it's spelled like Mukurtu, with the oo's being used, Mukurtu, but it's pronounced Mukurtu. And it's a digital collections platform that essentially allows you to put in cultural heritage items, and you can have granular access for various audiences. So if certain stories aren't meant to be told to certain people, then you can create a user identity profile and just not have those items be available to those people. So these are ways that we can collaborate to understand what types of knowledge we hold in our collections that might not even be appropriate for us to have, and think about ways that we can return or repatriate that knowledge.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that. In addition to Mukurtu, there's another program called Local Context that offers TK tags, traditional knowledge tags, and traditional ecological knowledge tags to your existing dams. And so you could just, in addition to what you're already doing, use local context and work with Indigenous communities in your area to decide what's appropriate and what's not, instead of moving just to Mukurtu, which is a great platform.
And this actually dovetails into our next question about how libraries, publishers, and aggregators can collaborate to increase the availability of Indigenous resources in electronic collections. Do we have more we'd like to build on with that?
No, and that goes, it literally does dovetail. It really is important to honor tribal sovereignty, work with your local Indigenous communities, reach out. They're waiting for you to reach out. They don't know what you have, and they really do want to know. You might have something that you're not super sure what it is, or it might not seem, super important, but in the right hands of the person who's educated within that tribal community, they know exactly what that is. That could have been something they've been looking for generations. So it's really important to make those connections.
I have just a thought to share. In thinking about adding to our electronic collections, sometimes there's all the money in the world and there isn't that specific collection that you can go and license. And perhaps people think that there is. It's really a lot of boutique selection work that librarians do for specialized collections. That's what we do in our library. We're really looking across all publishers, all presses, all aggregators. There isn't one call number range that we can just go to and go, yep, okay, great, we got it for the year, we're done. It takes a lot of time and a lot of care. And so in thinking about our electronic collections, how do we surface knowledge that perhaps already exists in existing electronic collections that you have? Doing some of that work for us through your metadata. We were talking a little bit about that last night. Maybe I should pass this over to Wiley.
Take it away, Wiley.
Well, this is a challenge for an independent publisher because I'll give you an example. Our academic journal started publishing in 1994. Well, we don't have the staff to digitize all those, so we've digitized from 2005 to now, and then we'll partner with partners like ProQuest and able to have those online databases, but even ebook conversion is an issue. We just recently have staff now and so we're starting to do our backlist because basically we have ebooks from like 2017 forward, but then all those titles. So unfortunately, only about a third of our catalog is even in ebook. And so I can speak from our own experience, which is probably relevant to other small independent presses that kind of have the same struggle, whether they're doing it in-house or contracting it out. And then there's the whole, we have a full-time person we're going to start doing audiobooks, but for us, there's lots of services out there that will convert to audiobook, but when you have Chickasaw language, we're just not going to do that through contract. It has to be taken with care and be accurate. So that part for us is a slow process. So we just need to find ways to partner with more institutions and libraries that want to expand their collection, and they want to include diverse voices and resources. And so it'll take time. We're getting better, but I know there's a lot of databases out there, and I know like the Adam Matthew database for Indigenous newspapers is a great database. If you're not subscribed to that one, it's a great one. The Chickasaw Nation has a newspaper that's been published monthly for decades, and so all that's fortunately all that's been digitized for years. Newspapers is a little bit farther ahead as far as being digitized versus books, but. So I don't know who in here is familiar with BISAC codes, subject headings, Book Industry Study Group, which is a nonprofit group that puts out these. This is basically the subject headings for mainly in the retail market for discoverability on subject headings. And so recently, this is how I met Lee, is
Yeah.
that we serve on the BISAC subject committee. And so I put in some work about 2 years where we looked at the indigenous codes for books. And at that time, prior to this year's release, there was about 30 indigenous codes across all subjects. And there's 50 over 5,000 codes. So there was only less than 30 subject headings for indigenous titles. And we were able, through some work, partnering with 17 we had a working group of 17 others that had indigenous interests, whether they were authors, publishers, or just people in the book metadata field that were passionate about this. And we were able to add 134 new subject headings for books. And so this is new. So industry adopted it in January. Ingram probably adopted it about March of this past year, but then it also requires, like myself, we cataloged our entire catalog using these codes. So eventually I feel like discoverability is going to help, and especially, don't disregard Google, because subject headings and eventually publishers are going to need to recode, industry is going to have to recode. And so I feel like it's going to take some time, but there are some things that are exciting that are happening. We have 17 codes for just fiction indigenous now. There was one, so there's 17 now across those. There's new codes for history that are specific to an indigenous lens, young adult, across lots of great new codes. So.
Yeah, and actually I want to add that most library vendors do ingest these codes along with LC, as well as applying their own subject headings. So as you search in, your preferred vendor's, sales interface, this information will be taken into account. So as you try to do your collection development and look for materials to acquire, to Wiley's point, as these codes start getting adopted and used, you may find it easier to find these materials when doing your purchasing. And that actually kind of takes us to our next question. How can academic librarians actively contribute to the preservation and promotion of indigenous knowledge within library spaces? That's kind of a perfect example to start with. Sarah?
Okay, I'll dovetail on the metadata piece, because at Huiwa Library, we've been acutely aware of this challenge for local discoverability, well, even national discoverability. Mm-hmm. We use the Library of Congress, but we're Canadian. So we do have Canadian subject headings up in Canada as a separate thesaurus. And for Indigenous materials, we didn't have anything that was respectful, representing our collections. So starting from there, adding Aboriginal and Indigenous into our metadata it's a good first step, but there are a lot of more appropriate terms that should be in our catalogs. We should be able to find ourselves in the library catalog. We should be able to find Musqueam in the catalog, not just in its anthropological grouping of Coast Salish peoples. So we developed a taxonomy where we have, our broader terms and our narrower terms, and we've got the appropriate representations of the names of First Nations people that in the way that they choose to represent themselves, with the proper First Nations language representation. It's based on a keyboard that's you may recognize from the International Phonetic Alphabet. So different diacritics that can be applied and represented appropriately in your catalog. That's a huge step. And that was something that Musqueam folks had been asking for a really long time. So we were able to do that. But back to the metadata, I mean, if you are a historian, you have to spend a lot of time understanding the different language, the different representation of names throughout history, throughout a period of time. And our library catalogs can be very powerful in helping people who aren't necessarily historians, who don't necessarily know all the colonial history, to be able to approach the catalog with today's current and appropriate terminology and get what they're looking for. so we have a lot of terms that we're using, and this is a really, I think, good example of how libraries and the publishing world can work together. Metadata, it's a huge undertaking to make change. So I was really excited to learn about this BISAC group. I had never heard of BISAC codes for publishing. And I was like, what? Y'all are using a completely different standard for metadata? Why? This doesn't make sense. So I'm really excited because people are doing this work, Wiley and Lee and other people. And we've got so many people in the Library of Congress, NACO, SACO, trying to standardize identity representation and questions around that. So I think it's a really exciting time to be asking, what can we do to collaborate?
I think another thing that would be helpful, if you're a librarian who is non-native, you can still join organizations like the American Indian Library Association to collaborate, get feedback, and do things in an ethical and very thoughtful way if you're unsure, rather than, just guessing or trying to figure it out on your own.
AILA is a great organization. They'll actually make recommendations, and then they'll also tell you books that they don't recommend. So just one example, like I said, I'm a publisher, but I'm one of my colleague and friends is Dr. Daniel Littlefield at the Sequoia National Research Center at the University of Arkansas. And one of the things that they did in their space that's pretty neat is they had a kiosk where they had gathered all the information about the removal of the 5 tribes. And so this was an interactive kiosk with information when a patron comes in. And so they took that information that they had gathered for years of research, and then they actually created a website from that. It's called journeyofsurvival.org. And it's the same kiosk, but in a website format. So a lot of times you can take things that you've gathered, and a lot of libraries have their own websites now. And so there's ways to put Indigenous content online and share what you're doing in your physical space as well. So.
All right, so I see we have about 8 minutes left. I did want to have time for Q&A. So we have a volunteer getting ready with a microphone. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and flag her over.